Thanks, Paul. Good evening, everybody, and it's great to see you all here this afternoon on such a lovely sunny May day. Whenever I speak anywhere, it rains. But anyway, it's broken a very long, dry period of May. Wonderful topic for me to talk about superannuation. Why do I think it's a wonderful topic? Because it is our business. But more importantly than that, it's because superannuation is such a massive pillar of financial services in this country. And it's a really important thing that we talk about. And there's a challenge we face as an industry, and I think as a nation, with a lot of people that have superannuation starting to question its value and whether it's worthwhile. So we need to have a conversation about that as an industry, and I'm going to start that conversation with you all this evening. So just to start so I can understand the audience, could you put your hand up if you don't have superannuation? Right. Okay. Come and see me afterwards, I'll give you one of my cards. Of course, most Australian workers do have superannuation and have had for a long time. It's a massive part of the financial services landscape, and we have a world-class system. So I'm going to get into some of the challenges around trust and transparency and engagement with superannuation, but we should start by acknowledging that successive governments have done a good job. Introducing superannuation all those years ago and then subsequently growing that pool of money has been a really fantastic outcome. And we have a world-class system. When you look around the world, people come to Australia to look at our model. I was overseas the other day with one of our APRA heads, Ross Jones. He's renowned around the world for the advice he gives on superannuation because of the industry we have here in Australia. And it's economically significant. Right? Why is that? It's $1.3 trillion. And if you talk to people like Ken Henry or others, they say that superannuation had a big role to play in helping Australia through the GFC. No news to you all here, I'm sure, in the industries that we're in, but the recapitalisation of Australian companies was enabled because of this big pool of superannuation savings we have. So it's a big part of the economy. And by 2030, you might be surprised, I know you see these numbers, they get updated all the time, we're going to have $6 trillion in superannuation. It is a massive pool of money, and with that, we're going to attract a lot of attention and a lot of scrutiny. It is the cornerstone of most Australians' retirement. So today, with the property market being the way it is, perhaps we're starting to see a generation coming through that might be less enamoured with buying their own home. They're going to invest in other things, and certainly a lot of money is going into deposit in banks. So maybe this generation will be the first generation where the biggest asset they have is superannuation outside their home. So it's going to be a big part of the future. So have we got a problem? Are there people out there that aren't engaged with their super or don't trust their super or indeed don't trust financial services companies that operate in the superannuation industry? Ooh, perish the thought. Right? But just think about it for a second. Are we losing investor confidence in superannuation? Are people really engaged with their money? Well, I put it to you that we're about to go through a period where if we're not very, very careful, we will have a lost generation in terms of engagement with their money. Certainly there's some reasons why I can prove that to you tonight that we have to work on together if we're going to change this trust in the industry. So let me just start talking about this lost generation. Let's start with the baby boomers. Have we let the baby boomers down? Did they take too much risk with their superannuation? Going into the GFC, were they too exposed to growth assets? But if you're 55 or 60 or 65, and nobody in this room of course is that old, and you're sitting around thinking about retirement or you're in retirement, right now you are terrified. You've lost a lot of your retirement savings or investment you've built up over your working lives. You're not sure if you can ever get it back, and you don't know what's going to happen next. The markets have created that unsettled feeling that they all have. And maybe we had too much exposure to equities, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but maybe not. But certainly you're sitting back and you're also thinking, well, superannuation's been a pretty good investment, I've got a nest egg. But then the government comes out with the budget and announces further changes. They announced some changes to the tax structures in superannuation. I'm sure you saw it. And the government's view was this will only impact 1% of Australians. It's only the wealthy that are going to be challenged by this tax change. And in my discussions with government, I put to them that they were wrong. It won't affect 1% of Australians. It'll affect all Australians, or at least those who are interested in their money. Why? Because taxing the wealthy is fine, redistribution of wealth is fine, those sort of things happen in government policy. But if you think about it from an Australian population point of view, half the people that aren't in the 1% think they're going to be or want to be. And the other half of the people who don't have the financial literacy that we all have just read more tax on super. So for a small gain in terms of revenue, what we have done again is change the system and reduce the trust in the system. And that's a dangerous thing. In fact, in the last 12 months, my very, very capable superannuation advisor tells me there's been 25 major changes in super just in the last 12 months. And you all know there's been hundreds, if not thousands, over the last decade. So it's a big number. In fact, when Bowen announced some of the changes around the Cooper Review and Stronger Super a few years ago, he made this strong statement that we were about to enter a period of policy stability for superannuation. Well, I'm not so sure if that's true. Certainly this government has introduced a good reform in increasing the superannuation guarantee from 9 to 12%. That's a big change and that will make a big impact for a lot of Australians. But there's some other things I think we could have thought through a little bit more. So the baby boomers, we've lost money, the markets have been challenging, we're a bit uncomfortable, a bit unsettled, tax gets moving around all the time. But we're kind of at the end of the road here, we're really entering our retirement phase, and so we're okay with super. What about the Gen X's and the Gen Ys? So I'm a Gen Xer who looks like a baby boomer who wants to be a Gen Y. And I'm sitting here and I've been pretty much in superannuation all my working life, and certainly the Gen Ys will be. I was brought up to be in love with property. My parents made lots of money in property. And superannuation for me has been kind of interesting and I'm okay with it. But most Gen Xers aren't engaging with their superannuation at all. We have this massive pool of people in default superannuation and it's getting bigger. Do you believe or can you accept the proposition that if we can get these people engaged with their money through advice or through making active decisions about their superannuation, it will have make a big difference to their retirement outcomes? I would say that's definitely true. And Gen Ys, who should be and have the greatest opportunity of all of the generations so far because of their active involvement with superannuation at a young age, if we can get them engaged young, will make a huge difference to their outcome. They're not even thinking about super, they're thinking about surfing, or they're thinking about getting jobs. So we've got a challenge there. We've got this massive pool of money and it becomes a honeypot as well. So why is there more challenges to trust in superannuation coming through here? So $1.3 trillion pot. If you're in any one of those generations, you'll have a different concern about investing and where you should be investing your money. But there is a fear that's emerging that the government won't be able to keep their hands off this pot of money, that they will want to actively get their hands on some of this money for nation building or infrastructure or other investments. And that's fine. I think we should be using that pool of money for those things. But we have to be very careful not to take the choice out of the hands of the investor or the fund, because the investment and the risk return has to be right for the investor. So we've had too many examples of tunnels and other things where perhaps the risk return, and no offence to anybody who's been involved with tunnels in the room, and we need infrastructure, we need to build these things, but we do need to get the risk return trade-off right between government and private sector and make sure savers don't suffer by taking on too much risk. The other thing that people are arguing is there's too much money in equities. The Australian average in equities and balanced funds about 60%. Oh, that'll be the phone. That's the alarm I set for 6:30 this morning, by the way. I've got to go to the gym. Bye. So is the government going to want to try and get their hands on this for infrastructure and other things? Have we had too many equities exposures, and have we then therefore taken too much risk on behalf of these older investors? These questions are now being debated quite vigorously. The average here is double the average of the rest of the world in equities. So I think you will see a shift away from equities towards fixed income and bonds, and that could be a good thing, but it has to be done carefully. Out of all this uncertainty, we've also seen another thing coming quite strongly down the road, which could be another source of uncertainty in the future, and that's the rise of self-managed superannuation funds. Who's got one? Who loves it? Yeah, fantastic. Go to the barbecue. I've got one, self-managed super. They are very, very good, appropriate vehicles for many people, but they're nowhere near as good as what people think they are, and there's no way that this many people who have got them need them. Right? They're expensive, there are obligations to trustees, there are investment decisions to be made, and it's become a very big bubble in terms of structures in superannuation. And it's very appropriate. I'm not knocking self-managed. We do lots of self-managed super funds, but we've got to make sure we get the right structures for the right people. How are we going to service these self-managed super funds? How are we going to create the infrastructure to service them? And what is the future for self-managed super funds, I think, is a big question which we're going to have to deal with in the future. So we've also got another source of distrust, I think, developing, and this is one where I want to spend 2 minutes, given that I get a chance to speak to industry colleagues just every now and again in the room, and that is because, and Paul said, how are we going with developing policy as an industry? How are we collaborating with our colleagues, our competitors, and different associations? And the answer is very poorly, in my view. We don't have a single policy agenda for superannuation. We have a very fragmented industry. We have industry funds on one side, we have retailers on the other side and banks. We have 2 industry associations for financial advisors. We have a number of self-interested groups. And no matter how noble the purpose might be in terms of lobbying for your particular aspect, when you go to government or try to form policy in that, with that approach, it's always seen as self-interest. So we do need to get organised and create a united front. There was an article in the paper about this a couple of weeks ago, and I agree that if we don't get organised to create the right policy discussions with the clients' and the country's interests in mind rather than our own interests, we're not going to get the best policy outcomes. And people see that. They read it in the newspaper, industry funds doing this and retailers doing that, and it creates challenges. And finally, I think that the reason why these people have lost trust is because they've lost trust in advice. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail, but certainly a big aspect of people wanting to move away from superannuation is they don't know where to get advice from, and if they do get it, they don't know how to trust it. So there's a few problems. How are we going to challenge ourselves to change this? How are we going to build some trust back into the system? Now, don't get me wrong. There's a very large number of people that are very happy with their superannuation. What I'm worried about is the trend heading up or is it heading down? And I think it's heading down. So what are we going to do about it? Let's start with advice. We've got more regulation coming down the pipe in financial services than we've ever had in wealth management, with stronger super and the VOFA reforms. When MLC started to look at this trust issue about 2006, some of you might recall that we made a decision that we thought the financial planning industry needed to move away from commissions towards fees, because we thought that conflicts of interest and remuneration structures were one of the big reasons why people didn't trust their financial advisor. Now think about the time. A perfect storm was emerging. $1.3 trillion in superannuation, some retail investor shocks like West Point. Every time you saw a picture of a financial planner in the newspaper, it was in a swimming pool with a shark swimming around them. The industry funds campaign, compare the pair. This one pays commission, this one doesn't pay commission. ASIC, all over everybody. Journalists having a field day. We had an industry that was in a trust crisis and it didn't realise it. And we acted. We said, right, we're going to move away from commissions towards fees. We think that's a great idea. Well, all hell broke loose, as you can imagine, when we said that, until people started to work through the issues with us to say, well, actually, there is a problem here. For the first couple of years, it was pretty tough. A couple of years later, the industry itself decided to self-regulate and move away from commissions in superannuation to try and change some of those conflicts. So we have to start to understand, as an industry, can we anticipate some of the things that are going to happen and act before there's a challenge or a drama? And can we create good policy or good outcomes by acting on our own rather than waiting for government regulation? Because I'm a very firm believer that we get the regulation we deserve. So the FOFA now comes in and says commissions should go and we should get rid of conflicts of interest and we should operate a professional financial planning industry. I think that's a great idea. And I think that we'll get there eventually through the FOFA reforms, although there's a lot of pain and challenge in implementing those things. We get higher professionalism, we get a better standard of advice. We build trust back in that advice profession. And then we've got stronger super. Cooper review comes out. What should we do about superannuation? It's a mess. Well, it is the envy of most countries in the world, and we should be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. But there obviously are some good intentions behind the Cooper review, which we support. And that is, for a very large number of Australians, and the statistic or the thing that they quote to me, which is not to be quoted outside this room, is 50% of Australians don't know what 50% means. And it's not true, but there are a lot of people out there who just do not have the financial literacy to look after their own financial affairs. They're very good at lots of other things, right? And they're really needing to be looked after. So we need to have a good, cheap, value for money superannuation system. That's a good intention. But what we have to be careful of is then saying it's done. My super's fine. I'll have my superannuation to a default fund. I can now go off and do the other things that are interesting in my life and forget about my money. So we believe, as an industry and as a country, set and forget is not the answer. If we're going to rebuild trust, we have to engage people with their money. It will make a big difference for them. And so we've set about doing that. We have a business called Plum. Plum is a big corporate superannuation business advisor, and we have some very, very large companies, some of the largest companies in Australia in that superannuation company that we run. And we set about an engagement model. The quest was, can we actually engage people with their money, even if they're not financially literate or that interested? And we've run hundreds, if not thousands, of workplace seminars all over the country. And we've had some really interesting outcomes. First, 76% of members in Plum actually choose their own investments. They don't default. That's a huge win because we can actually match their needs and their risk profile and their age to the investments they need, rather than just lumping them in with everybody else. The average contribution for members in Plum is 15%. Not 9, not 12, 15. Why? Because 41% of them are actually making voluntary contributions to superannuation. So there is proof in a big company, diverse workforces all over Australia, that you can engage people with their money and their outcomes will be significantly better. So if you go back to the first part of my discussion tonight where I say there are things that are eroding trust, what it does is it ups the ante on us to do the other things that engage people with their money to reassure them that superannuation is a fantastic investment for them. The other aspect is we need to offer new types of advice. Now, I don't want to embarrass people, so you don't have to put your hand up here, but does anybody here have a financial advisor? A small number. And in fact, we think about 20% of Australians do get financial advice. And MLC set about a quest. We said, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could get 50% of Australians to seek advice? Because we know it'll make a huge difference to their retirement outcome. Just that single thing, getting to talk to somebody about their money will help. And it was the wrong target because we were trying to get 50% of Australians to get advice the way it was done then or the way it's done today, which is a full service, full sophisticated financial plan, ongoing fees and service forever. And guess what? Only 25% actually want that. So we can't get 50% if only 25% of them want it or know about it. 20% of Australians would love to have a financial plan, but they don't want to see a financial planner to get it, or if they do, they want to self-regulate. They want to have self-control, this idea of having their own fund. And 33% of Australians want to get advice at a point in time. They want simple advice. They've just got a question about their super. We have created an industry through regulation and through our own actions that has made it virtually impossible for these people to get service. So we've ignored them. There's your lost generation. 33% of Australians want something, we can't give it to them. So through FOFA and some of the other reforms and through things that we're doing at MLC and many people here from various other financial services are doing, we're starting to work on ways that we can give people what they need, which is simple, cheap, effective advice. And that's the most important thing we can do to engage them with their money. Because I think, and I'll put it to you, and this is maybe, you wouldn't expect me to say this, that the last 100 years or so, and MLC is 125 this year, we've been distributing our products and providing our services almost entirely through intermediaries and advisors. Right? Within 10 years, I think it'll be more like 50%. Because the consumer is changing the way they want to interact with us, and they're changing the way that they want to get their products and services and their advice. It doesn't mean we don't still think that they would be better served getting advice, by the way. But it does mean that they're changing their behaviours. You've heard of the internet and other things. So, if we've got a retirement savings gap in this country, and it's huge, as in what do people need to retire on comfortably and what is actually going on in the private savings system, and we want to close it, what are the 2 or 3 things we can do? Well, policy, we can increase the superannuation guarantee from 9 to 12%. Advice, we can get people to make smart decisions with their money. But I think that if we don't work on this trust issue and get people engaged with their money, we'll never close the gap. So that's the challenge for us. Now, we could close the gap. An interesting idea would be a stock market that goes up. That would be fantastic. Has a big impact if you have positive returns over a long period of time. We could have people that didn't live as long. We have a longevity challenge. Everybody is quite excited about living a long time. It's not a very nice experience if the last 10 or 15 years you haven't got any money. So it's about engagement. It's about that trust question. Getting that sorted will make the biggest difference. There's other things I think the industry is confronted by, which I might just move on to just for 2 minutes because I know we're right on time. Is there new ways of investing or new ideas in investing that we need to embrace to make sure that we're getting the best outcomes for our clients and our investors? And if you look at this asset allocation question about all this money in equities, it's happened because we're all conscious of the peer group, right? Now, as the CEO of MLC, should I say we're all conscious of the peer group? I absolutely should, because that's the problem. We've all said, if we all do the same things, we'll all get the same outcomes. If it all goes down, we all go down. If it all goes up, we all go up. We're safe. Right? That's just commercial competition. Reality is we haven't done enough work on working out what absolutely should be done for the client in their circumstances and moving away from the peer group. So the asset allocation of equities, it was too high, in my view, for many investors who didn't get advice. Do we have the wherewithal in the corporate bond market to bring more bonds and debt and securities into portfolios? Not yet, but it's coming fast. And if you think about a deallocation from equities from, say, 60 to 40, you see a lot of money trying to find its homes in the bond markets. And then there are other things that we can do in portfolios which you might think are really risky. Why would private equity or venture capital have a place in a superannuation portfolio? The answer is we should have those types of investments available for the type of investor who needs them. MLC runs about $4.5 billion in private equity and venture capital. It's the largest private equity program in the country. Not many people know that. We had a really good week, actually, because we invested in a thing called Facebook. We got our first tranche at 7 cents. So we're quite happy with that, 460 times the original investment. So that can happen. The point is there's all sorts of different types of investments, and we need to open the debate up and not just all do the same things and come up with the same plain vanilla outcomes. We've got to think about challenging ourselves to find new ways of investing. I was lucky enough recently to go to Israel on a trade mission around financial services. Fascinating country. If you haven't been there, you've got to go. It's a really interesting place. They have an amazing system where they have been able to marry up pools of money in pension and superannuation funds and venture capital to advance the innovation and science and technology businesses they have in that country. They're the second most prodigious VC and PE structures in the world to Silicon Valley. You might not know that. So when I was there with Bill Shorten and various members of the science community, the debate started about how do we access this big pool of superannuation money for infrastructure, sure, and there's challenges there, but for science and bringing technology and Australian innovation into the commercial market. Is there a way of doing that? Only if you get the risk-return trade-offs right. But what they do in Israel is the government matches the innovation money and provides incentives for people to do that. And I think there's things like that that we can talk about. Show people who are in superannuation that their money is being used for very interesting and good things for the nation, and the returns are fine and the risk is managed. Those sort of things will re-engage people with their money. So we should have the debate with government, with the science community, with superannuation funds. How do we get that stuff to work? There's just a few of the opportunities we've been thinking about. So let me just conclude by saying a couple of things. There is a very tenuous link between a client and their money, and it's called trust. And if they don't trust a financial services organisation, or if they don't trust a financial services structure like superannuation, and that link breaks, it's game over. Sure, they have to have their 9% going to 12% put in, but it isn't enough. So what I question myself all the time, and our firm strives to do, and I know many of you do, is to rebuild that trust in the industry. And there are things we need to do to make that happen. It's not a honeypot just for everybody to dip into to get money out of. We've got to balance returns and risk. We have to understand how people want to engage with their money and make it easy for them, not impossible for them. And as this pool grows to $6 trillion by 2030, if we engage them, we can make it 7 or 8 and start to close that savings gap. It's certainly something that we feel very strongly about at MLC, and something that we're very proud to be part of as we rebuild this trust that's breaking at the moment. So I might stop there and say thank you very much for coming along tonight, and I think we have a chance for some questions.
We do. Thank you very much. Now, please take Now, I will open up the floor. If you do have questions, let me know. But I'm the AB+F Managing Director and Publisher, Andrew Stavick, will start us off.
Steve, I've always got questions, so I don't think this is an exception.
Dorothy Dixer.
No, it's not Dorothy Dixer, actually. It's going to be a challenging one for you. The MLC, like with all the other banks and financial institutions, have got an investment and financial planning arm, MLC being the NAB's planning arm. the idea of the cross-sell and the bank and the funds management business being able to work off each other was the idea 10 years ago as the banks purchased the investment arms. But that really hasn't taken off significantly here in Australia. Is this part of the solution? I think I get the feeling that Australians don't necessarily always like their banks, but they actually trust their banks in most cases. They actually know that their banks are stable. They go there for financial products, and as they grow and have years and years, they really do establish sometimes very good relationships with their banks. Why hasn't it here in Australia, but why hasn't there been success in that cross-sell and the bank to planner and then investment relationship really worked well?
So it's a great question, and I suppose since NAB acquired MLC 11 years ago, that's pretty much what I've been working on. For the first few years it was interesting because there was a real misunderstanding about what both businesses did, so that just took a long time to get people to understand. I think getting an MLC brochure in a branch was verboten, it was not the thing to do. The last few years thankfully have been a lot better than that. We should just start by saying at MLC now we have a reasonable success with cross-sell. We get about 40% of our investment flow from the bank. We get about 2,000 referrals a week into our financial planning businesses, and we're getting more and more corporate and business super referrals out of our business bank, which is fantastic. But it still isn't at the levels that you see in some countries in terms of the number of products that people buy or the penetration we have. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is in some countries you can actually, take the UK for example, you can package things up and give discounts and other things. That has backfired big time because that's proved to be a compensation event where you've forced people to do some strange things. The other is that for many, many years, I think the banks were busy, certainly in NAB's case, lending money. And for the bankers in the room, I mean, up until 2009, it was pretty busy. And we had business credit lending growth at sort of north of 15. There was a lot of opportunities for people to get out there and do their thing. And to talk about wealth and wealth management and the other services was quite difficult to get the time to do that. That's changing now, of course, as well. And the other is just education and people understanding what's going on. People say to me, cross-sell's all about getting the incentives right. Well, sure. I mean, it's self-interest. As Joseph Healy says, you back that horse in every race. But there is other things that need to be done, getting people to understand how it works. We sit down with business bankers and ask, and our business bankers are fantastic, as are all the other banks. But our guys know their clients pretty well. They'll tell you that they've got all of the client's wallet. When you actually do an assessment of that client and all the other needs they might have, it's not the case. So we have to sort of work slowly and get those things moving. But it is moving now.
Steve Hugh Harley, thanks for a great presentation. I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about your trip to Israel and what you learned there. But maybe as a way into that, some of your comments made me think, is there potentially a link between declining trust in politicians and declining trust in superannuation?
So let me go to Israel. The general trust answer around politicians, around markets, around us, around all those things is that in almost every area I think we've got work to do. And I think the political scene here is really tough for business and for investors and for the poor old mum and dad out there. They're pretty worried about all sorts of things. When you, I think, come out with a budget the way the government did and change the taxes at the very top end, which maybe in a normal, stable, steady, reasonable market environment might have been a reasonable thing to contemplate. I think in the timing and when it was done, that really has kind of rocked people a lot in terms of their view on. We had a conversation unsolicited over here. The thing with superannuation is I don't know what they're going to do with it in the next 20 years' time, and it's going to be there in 20 years' time. So there's certainly a political stability, and the trust in the politicians not putting their fingers in is a big part of it. And there are other things, as I said before. Israel is an amazing place. I could talk about it a lot, actually, because not only is it a very interesting historic place, but from a business point of view, it was really interesting. How is it that a small country of only a few million people that's in a pretty hostile place and they're not all that friendly with each other? I won't go into the politics of it. How is it that it ends up developing this thriving venture capital and private equity sector in technology? And I was trying to understand, we were trying to understand, is because we have a problem in Australia commercialising our innovation here. And there's two or three things that I think maybe I'll give you a view on. One is their kids go into the army. And there's a difference between going to college at 19 and doing what I did and going to the army for 2 or 3 years and having a heavy responsibility load and a lot of challenges that you have to deal with. And they come out of that perhaps, more aware of their abilities and more confident, and then they go for it, they take risks. Second thing is the Israeli mother syndrome, which is when Jimmy has a startup and makes $20 million, they take an ad out in the newspaper and say, Jimmy's made $20 million out of his startup, isn't that fantastic? And then you go home and mum says to me, hey Steve, what are you doing? Jimmy's made $20 million, right? You've got to get out there and have a go and be part of it. So they very consciously take risk. And the third thing, and there'll be lots of things, but the third and maybe the last one is, a lot of the money goes to the people who have failed before. In Israel, it is not a problem if you start a VC or a PE and it doesn't work once or twice. Third time, fantastic. They look for them because they know they've learned along the way. In Australia, if you fail, it's all over Red Rover. You're not going to get another cent from anybody. So there's a different cultural aspect to it. And there's a few other things, but it's a really interesting place. And they've got hugely successful companies over there, and it's really interesting to see.
Thanks, Steve.
Steve, it's not a sponsored question, but one of the other problems, we talk about advice and trust, and I guess this is something I'm conscious of talking about as well. Advice is a process, so people take advice, they receive different types of information. Obviously, the only tangible proof, when all is said and done, is the document you get from your advisor. I welcome your views. Is the whole possibility of having simple, plain English style advice, is it possible? If so, what are some of the ways that's being challenged?
Yeah, so I do have some views on this. I think for a long time, we convinced ourselves, and the industry tied itself up in knots through FSR and implementing the disclosure regime by saying, you really need to provide a 60, 70, 80, 90, 100-page plan. And then I think we got addicted to it because selling a 90-page plan to a client for $5,000, the client says, whoa, that's a lot of work, right? And in fact, the client really will probably read 2 or 3 pages in that. So we do have to break that down to what is it they're buying. Is it the 90 pages or is it the advice, the genuine ongoing coaching, the challenge around are they doing the right things with their money? Do they understand the risks they should be taking? Is there insurance in place? Do they have to consolidate their debts? That's the real value of advice. And it's the conversation, not the document. But we do have to make sure that we cover ourselves in terms of compliance and other things, but it's a bit over the top, I think.
Any further questions? Oh, yes.
Steve, the practical question, I was interested in Plum where you said that the outcomes there have been 76% of people take an active interest in their money and they've got 15% as opposed to 9 or 12. Everybody runs seminars and people come along, it's a bit like getting your wrist cut or whatever. What have you done to engage that interest? What practical things have you done to get people not in love with it but at least interested in it?
Yeah, it's a great question. It starts with the genesis of Plum. We were lucky enough to be in a joint venture with Vanguard in the early stages of Plum, who shared with us a lot of the learnings from engaging investors in the States. And there are lots of different techniques and investments you make in the right type of websites and the right type of opportunities for people to engage. And then innovation emerges from that. For example, what we found in a lot of the bigger companies that had a lot of blue-collar workers working in sort of manufacturing or other environments, getting them to engage with a website was fine if they were anywhere near a computer and had the idea that they'd like to do that. So we put kiosks in the workplace and got permission from the employer for them to have 30 minutes or 45 minutes when they wanted to come and log in and have a look at their super and have a play around, things like that. Just to respectfully say to people, just start thinking about this stuff and start looking at it. And then when they get something that says, what, you should have a think about what you're going to do here, they tend to act. And it has been really, really successful. We have a thing called the Escalator Program, which is, I don't know if you've heard of this, Paul, but it's an idea where everybody commits to giving a certain percentage of their future pay increases into the fund. So if I'm going to get a 2% pay rise, I commit that I'll give 0.5% of whatever future pay rise I get. And it's the chocolate and bananas psychology. Have you heard the psychology? You have a lecture here today, I say, right, I'll be here next week, you guys all come. I'll bring chocolates and bananas. how many of you would like a chocolate and how many of you would like a banana? Most people say I'll have a banana because it's a healthy option, and when you get here next week, everybody takes a chocolate, right? Instant gratification. So you've got to get earlier in the process and say, we'd like to get some of your commitment to save now before the chocolates are in front of you. So when the chocolates come, you won't even see it going out. They don't even know that they've got these things going into their super, and we tell them later on and they go, oh, that's great, I'm contributing to this. There's things like that. It's really important to understand how people think and then adapt to that.
One more here.
Hi, Steve. Just a question about, you talked about increasing penetration of advice. And I wonder if there's a challenge there. I'm interested to get your views on whether a part of it is about demonstrating the value of advice. A small sample size here, but I've had conversations with people where they've said, well, I don't go to an advisor because I know what they're going to tell me. They're going to tell me to pay off my mortgage faster and make more voluntary contributions to my super, and that's about it. And I already know those things, so why do I need this? So do you see a challenge there, and how do you see us overcoming that?
Absolutely, it's a challenge. I was talking to a group a couple of days ago of younger people, and I asked them if they'd go and see a financial planner. And of course, some of them had and most of them hadn't. And I put it to them, the reason why they didn't was because they might get told they have to do something. And that's confronting. I don't want to be told to do something, I'll make up my own mind. That's how young people operate these days. The reality is they don't have the wherewithal, the literacy to make those decisions themselves in many cases. So, does most 25-year-olds need a $5,000 financial plan and an ongoing service with a financial planner? They do not. Do they need to have a conversation with somebody that talks to them about the basics of financial planning and putting those services in place? My word, they do, and it'll make a huge difference to them. So can we do it for $300 or $400 instead of $5,000? Or in fact, can we do it in a way that engages them with the advice process? We would like to think that we practice catch and release at NAB. We don't actually catch and kill everything that comes in the door. We get them to come in and we tag them and we say, this is a great thing, you're interested in your money, and then they go away and then they come back another day. And over time they become more interested in the process, and it makes a big difference to them.
Time for one more. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking